Welcome back. As always, I'd recommend that if you're joining us today for the first time, you should go back and review our previous recordings. Now that we've established that the basics of parenting really is cultivating that relationship with our children, our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the relationship between our children and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we will try and go through now where in different places Chazal, or even as we'll start with the pasuk in Mishli, Chanoich Denar al Pi Darkoi, how every child is unique and how we must take that uniqueness and nurture it and cultivate that uniqueness within the parameters of our relationship with our child and our child's relationship with the world, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Before we do that and before we go into that uniqueness, there is one point, however, that I would like to point out. There was recently a study done by different scientists around the world in regards to DNA. And what they seem to have found is that they can pinpoint certain cells of DNA that seems to correlate with generational trauma. In other words, trauma that generations ago went through seems to have been ingrained so deeply that it actually went through to the DNA, which means that today when a child is born, they carry with them the baggage, let's call it, the trauma that generations before them went through. Now, of course, we can look at this very simply as what the Arizal told us, that today we are all Gilgulei Neshamas. We are all Gilgulim of Neshamas that already came down in this world before and now had to come down again for a certain tikkun. Of course, we can open a Derech Hashem, where the Ramchal tells us that Adam Rishon, of course, came down completely balanced, a 50-50 balance of Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, and all he had to do was make the right decision one time, and that we today are at a certain disadvantage. In other words, before we approach the idea of uniqueness of our children and how we must try and find the uniqueness of each child and cultivate that, we also must take into consideration the incredible depth of the idea of Gilgulim, of the idea that we're born today with a disadvantage, and of course of this idea, which seems to be true, of the generational trauma, of the fact that we did go throughout the generations incredible levels of trauma, and this seems to go through to our children. So when we look at our children, we must take into consideration as hard as it is for us to face the challenges that we face, and the fact that how hard it is for us to cultivate our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we must assume it's actually even harder for them. Now, with that in mind, let's start indeed with that pasuk in Mishli. Chanoich lenar al pi darkoi, gam ki yazkin lo yosser mimena. Which, of course, as soon as we look at this pasuk, we realize how it goes into rhythm with our series. The pasuk tells us, if you do the first part, Chanoich lenar al pi darkoi, if you give chinuch for your child al pi darkoi, which of course is something that we will discuss at length, but if you do that, gam ki yazkin lo yosser mimena, then when this child will grow old, he will also stick to that chinuch. In other words, exactly what we have been discussing. Chinuch is building a relationship with our children. And of course, the point of a relationship is that it lasts. The point of a relationship is that our relationship with our children will grow and will grow to the maximum of our abilities. And then that relationship will transform into a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, will transform into our children, creating that relationship with their children. But Shlomo HaMelech and Mishli is telling us that this is dependent on Chanoich lenar al pi darkoi. We can only get to Gam Ki Yazkin Lo Yosser Mimena. We can only get to a point when we know that our children will continue this path if we stick to the first part of the pasuk, which is Chanoich lenar al pi darkoi. And to explain that part of the pasuk, we will start with the Gaon. The Vilna Gaon starts off by bringing down the Gemara, where the Gemara says, Rav Ashi says, that if a person is born with a mazel of madim, something we would call, for example, a doimi, a red mazel. And Rav Ashi says that a person who is born with that mazel can have three things. There's three choices for a person with that mazel. Either, of course, he can be a Reitzeach. It's a mazel of blood. He can kill people. Or he can be a doctor who is a bloodletter, let's call it, takes out blood from people. He can be a shoichet. Or, of course, he can be a moil. He can do the mitzvah of milah, which, of course, is also blood. The Vilna Gaon tells us what the Gemara is telling us here is an incredible thing. There are certain things that you cannot change. The fact that this child was born with a mazel madim, edoimi, with a muzzle of blood, you cannot change that fact. He is going to be someone who has something to do with blood. However, what Rav Ashi told us in this Gemara is, says the Gaon, that this person has the bechira to be one of three things. He can be a tzaddik, he can be a beinani, he can be a rasha. Again, he does not have the bechira to take away his muzzle of being an amadim, of being someone who has something to do with blood. But he does have the bechira to be a tzaddik, a beinani, or a rasha. And the Gaon says, and that's why Rav Asher picked these things. He can be a rasha, he can be a reitzeach, he can be a beinani, he can be a doctor or a shoichet, or he can be a tzaddik and use his nature, nurture that nature to be a moil, to be a tzaddik who uses his nature for a mitzvah. So the Vilna Gaon tells us, you know what Chanoich the Nar al Pi Darkei is? Don't try and change your child. If your child is an active child, you can't transform them and change them into being a calm child. What you could do is take their active nature and nurture it in the right way, so that at least they can be a beinani, but maybe they can be a tzaddik. Our job as parents, says the Vilna Gaon, based on the Pasuk in Mishli and this Gemara, is not to change the nature of our children, because the nature is something you cannot change, says the Gaon. What we could do and what we must do is nurture that nature. Nurture it to a point where we take them of, instead of choosing the path of a rasha, they can become a beinani, or even maybe become a tzaddik. So now that we're going into trying a little bit to understand the uniqueness of each child, this is the first and underlying rule. The rule of the Gaon on Chanoich the Nar al Pi Darkei. We must remember, we're not here to change the nature of our children. You know why? It's impossible. What we're here to do is to teach them how they can take their nature and use it for a better purpose. Use it to become a beinani. Use it to become a tzaddik. And the Vilna Gaon tells us, do you know how you cultivate the relationship that it should last for generations, that it should last for them to create their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and their relationship with their children? If you don't try to change their nature, but instead teach them al pi darkei, teach them by their nature how they can nurture it to become better people. When you do that, they will realize that all you had intended was your relationship with them and how they can be in a better relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and their future children. This series is produced by TorahWire.org, sponsored by the DonorsFund.org. For all your charitable giving, open an account today at the DonorsFund.org.